Hi, Fiona. Okay, I'm going to just let it run a little. So we're up to 85 people. I'll just give it a minute or two more. Maybe we'll get up to 100. Maybe we won't. Hey, Russell. Hi, Erin. Iran, not Erin. Iran. Hi. Okay. Vasilis, you've got your hand up already. We haven't started yet. Or are you questioning my my jumper? It's okay. Don't worry, Vasilis. It's okay. Okay, we'll start. Oh no, we won't start. 98. Two more. 99. 100. Yes. Now we can start. Cool. So welcome everyone. As you can see, I'm live and direct from downtown Shanghai again this week. Actually, I'm not. I'm somewhere else. I'm not anywhere as exciting as Shanghai. I just didn't change the picture from last week when we were talking about China. So welcome everyone, and thank you for being here again. I see some familiar names for people who've attended before. Are you mad? This is it's me again, monologuing for 90 minutes. Actually, that 90 minutes, I suppose, is quite interesting. I could stand at a football match and just talk to myself for the whole match. So here I am again, monologuing. So anybody who's here, welcome back. For anybody who's not been here before, welcome for the first time. If you give me just a second, I'll bring my slides to the front. So this is the next one in a series of webinars that EMLYON and me have been running as part of what we thought initially was to help students who are locked down and maybe don't have contact with their tutors and other students. But it's kind of gone on from there. And as I say, every week we've got lots and lots of other people who find whatever it is that we're doing really interesting. My intention was for this to be the penultimate webinar, but due to popular demand, these webinars will continue. Next week, we're going to talk about social media. In 2 weeks' time, yes, we've got a brilliant one, which I'm really, really excited about, which is about football in the Gulf region. I'm very lucky, or we are very lucky to have James Montague, with whom some of you may be familiar, who writes extensively about football in the Gulf region. But we've also got Dr. Christian Ulrichsen, who is an expert on the Middle East and the Gulf region specifically, and is a football fan. And so we're going to be talking about airline sponsorships and Saudi Arabia and Newcastle United and Qatar and Paris Saint-Germain and the World Cup and so forth. So the one in 2 weeks is hopefully going to be a good one. And then after that, maybe we'll carry on with the webinars if there's demand for it, or if there are specific requests that we get. We'll continue. But I think as the lockdown ends, we possibly won't do these every week. We'll do them far less frequently. If you do have any ideas or any suggestions or any requests for people that you want us to get together to be part of a webinar, or if there are particular things that you would like us to discuss, then let me know. And I'll do what I can. What more can I say? I'll do what I can. So this particular one is about engaging, as you can see, engaging football fans, but it's about engaging sports fans, full stop. So I'm going to approach this in terms of football fans, But I appreciate that in the audience today and amongst the participants, you know, that some of you are motor racing fans, some of you are rugby fans, some of you are cricket fans, some of you are basketball fans, handball fans. And I think in general terms, many of the things that I'm going to talk about are equally as applicable to sports other than football. Now, what's particularly, I think, is particularly important to say from the outset, or certainly is significant for me, is I do a lot of work with teams and clubs and governing bodies and leagues in sport. And I would say that probably over the last 5 years or 6 years, everywhere I go, people talk about fan engagement. So it's all about fan engagement. And I sit in meetings with enthusiastic people talking about fan engagement. And I meet some really bright people with some really clever ideas, and they're really inspiring. And yet very often I sit amongst groups of people and they're saying, fan engagement, fan engagement, fan engagement. And I sit there and I think, you don't really know what you're talking about. I'm not going to name names. Actually, if you pay me a large amount of money, maybe I'll name names. No, I won't name names, even if you pay me money. Just pay me the money. But I'm not going to name names, and I'm not saying this is everyone, but from time to time, I come across people who I just think, you don't know what you're saying. You don't know what you're talking about. And it has been on that basis that I kind of stepped back. And, you know, maybe 4 or 5 years ago, I thought, actually, I don't know what this means either. I don't know what fan engagement means. And so I thought long and hard about this. And as a consequence of it, I've worked with organizations, including UEFA, around, for instance, fan engagement projects. But most recently, what I've been doing is to do a lot of work around fan engagement in the Gulf region. So in Saudi Arabia and Qatar, in Abu Dhabi, in Dubai, but also into Turkey as well, Kuwait and countries in that region. So I've just written a piece of work on that, which hopefully will be published in due course. But prior to that, I'd been involved in a big fan engagement study in the Gulf region with 7,000 respondents. And prior to that, a lot of what I'd written around fan engagement had been in an East Asian context. So in terms of Japan and China, South Korea, and certainly one of my successful PhD students from the past wrote specifically about fan engagement. So what I'm going to do today is really to give my view, which in one part is practical, but in another part is a little more conceptual. It's not too obscure and not too esoteric. And as many of you know who turn up to my webinars now, I like to start with a story. So hopefully by the end of this, you know, I'm not going to be able to change the world, and I'm not going to be able to fill football stadiums or sports stadiums full of people. But hopefully the things that I talk about can help you reflect a little more on what fan engagement actually means, what it actually is. Now, again, just for those of you who've not been before, I'm doing this alone. So there's no physical infrastructure behind me. I don't have a team of professionals waiting to catch me if I fall. So this means that I talk, and then from time to time I'll break off and look at the questions. So I've not got somebody looking at the questions for me. I'll look at the questions myself. So I'll tell you when I'm going to look at questions and points. So if people do want to say things as we go through, by all means feel free to post in the chat forum. Or alternatively, feel free to say something in the Q&A section, and I'll try and get to you. As ever, just to say thank you to everybody who's been doing something positive and helping others during this time. Just to say as well that we're doing this as part of something that we've been calling for the last 6 or 7 weeks, Sport Assist. On Twitter and on LinkedIn. So if you look at hashtag Sport Assist on Twitter or LinkedIn, you will find other academics offering help. You'll find some practitioners too offering help. There have been several cases over the last several weeks of staff, academic staff helping students, and of even sponsorship professionals helping businesses. So, you know, by all means, use the hashtag if you want to ask a question, you want to look at what we've been doing. All of the previous webinars have been recorded. the information is there if you want it. As ever, for those of you who fall asleep by the end, which I think if I was listening to myself, I would probably fall asleep by the end. Certainly if you listen to what I've got to say to you today, I even fell asleep when I was practicing that. So, I can appreciate. So in anticipation that some people will fall asleep or alternatively leave, or you've got other things to do in a short while, I'll understand. So I like to give some readings. The interesting thing about academics, notice I use the word academics, of which I suppose I must be one. Academics don't really write about fan engagement. One of the strange things about academia is we take a long time very often to catch up with what the rest of the world is doing. So the published material on this is somewhat sparse. Now, I bring up this particular book because there is a chapter on engagement in the book. And there are other books out there. There are sport marketing books. There are books on football, books on different types of sport, where people talk about engagement. But I have to say that it's as a concept, as an issue, as an area, it's not especially well covered. And I think in the world of practitioners, you probably find much more written about engagement and more compelling accounts of engagement than I think most academics provide. Now, hopefully I'm not one of those academics, but if you leave the webinar today saying yes, he is one of those academics, that's fair enough. I think it's something that academics need to catch up on. In terms of journal papers, and keep in mind, for those of you who've got your pen and paper and trying to write these down, don't screenshot this if nothing else. But if you don't want to screenshot it, the recording of the webinar should be available, I would imagine, Monday, because tomorrow is a public holiday in France. So should be available Monday. The work by Yoshida at the bottom was what really first caught my attention. I think it's particularly interesting to look at Yoshida's work, and that's one of a number of studies that this guy has done. And for me, that was, I would say that in terms of the development of the academic literature is a really important study. And there are several other studies by Yoshida, as I mentioned. But as I was preparing for the webinar today, I noticed the studies by Stander in South Africa, and obviously South Africa is a particular place with a particular environment. And so some of the things about fan engagement in South Africa may not be relevant in France or Britain or Germany or Spain or wherever. But nevertheless, I think the generalities of what Stander talks about is really interesting. And so I would recommend that you look at these things. One thing can I say to you, that if you go into Google Scholar, for those of you who are unfamiliar with Google Scholar is often a really good source of free stuff, because normally to access academic papers, you have to be a member of a university, a member of staff or a student, and then you can use the electronic library. Even then, your library may not pay a subscription to these pieces of work. So if you go to Google Scholar, so everything that I've specified here, and I do this deliberately so you can look at them, go to Google Scholar and you should be able to find the full text versions of these particular pieces. I think the one at the top there is really interesting. This is not necessarily on Google Scholar. You can access by clicking the link. But what I find interesting is that it sets the context for something that we will talk a little bit more about later. Okay, so that's the reading. So as usual, let me start with a story. And I'm going to tell you a story. Okay, I'm going to tell you a story. And this story is my story. And as I go through this story, which is my story, what I want you to do is just think, wow, what a great story. This guy's a great storyteller. That's what I really want you to do. No, it's not. It's not. What I really want you to do is I tell you my story. What I want you to do is to tell yourself your story. Because your story is certainly just as valuable as mine, but possibly even more interesting than my story. But I think in our stories together, there's something really, really important about fan engagement. Now, I've noticed already that some of us in the group today, so we've got 145 people on the group today, some of us are males and some of us are females. Some of us are younger, some of us are older. Some of us are in Europe, some of us are in Asia. Some of us are less wealthy, some of us are more wealthy. Some of us are just mad, crazy fans, and some of us are not. So I think what's really important about the story that you tell yourself is that story forms the basis of lots of stories, and understanding those stories, and we'll come back to this whole thing about stories. Coming back to those, looking at those stories and understanding those stories is an important part of fan engagement. Okay, so let me tell you my story. So some of you may have heard me talk about this before. I like to talk about it because it's important to me. It feels important to me. So I hope you can see my cursor. So with my cursor, this here is a hospital. And if I remember correctly, in this hospital, this is the maternity unit. So this is where the kids are born in this town. This is a school. This is the main street. You probably see there are some churches there on the main street. So on this main street, you've got banks and government buildings and shopping malls. So this is the main street. And then this is a cemetery. So what I like to think in terms of when I show this photograph is you're born, you go to school, you work, and then you die. And in the middle of this life, there's a football stadium. And in this house here, this is where I lived when I was a kid. So that's the start of my story. When I was a kid, I think I was 1 year old when my father, and I've tried to have this conversation with my mother because my father isn't around anymore. Why did Dad buy that house? That's another thing for another day. That's a webinar in itself, trying to get my mother to tell me why my dad bought this house. But this is the house that my dad decided he was going to buy, and this is where I lived from when I was 1 year old. So every day when I woke up and the curtains were opened, there was the football stadium. And when I walked to school, I had to walk past the football stadium. So this was really interesting because my first engagement with football was about geographic location. It was easy to get to. Okay, it was easy to get to. So all I had to do was cross the road. It was easy to get to. Now just here, there used to be a wall. And in this wall, there was a big gate. And at 4 o'clock every Saturday afternoon, they would open the gate. And this was to let people out. So people, and if you know my team, and some of you do know my team, if you knew my team, there were very often lots of people trying to get out at 4 o'clock. So the match kicks off at 3 and by 4, they're trying to get out. I understand that. But they would open the gates at 4 o'clock. So if people wanted to leave, they could leave. But very often what I would do with my friends, we were kind of 5, 6 years old, we would go in through the gates and see what was happening. So this was the first time that I started to go and see football, is because I would go in through the gates. But there was something about geographical proximity. It was very close to my house. That was my engagement. That was my first engagement. But then my second point of engagement is this man that I lived with, otherwise known as my father, said to me, "There's only one team, son." And this was the team. And my dad at that time was a season ticket holder. So, geographic location, first thing. Second thing, my father. My father. So at this point, I'm not going to ask you. I am going to ask you, but I'm going to leave you to think about this yourself. What was the first sport you watched and who was there? And I can guarantee you now, the first sport that you watched, you're probably still watching now. That first team that you had is still probably your team now. And who was there when you watched this team or you engaged with this sport was probably a family member. Now, obviously we can't see each other, but when I normally sit in a lecture theatre and I get people to say, who are you with? Who are you with? My mother, my cousin, my uncle, my father, my sister. So family members are really, really important. And I hate my father for doing this to me. I hate my father for doing this. I wish I could have been a Real Madrid fan or a Bayern Munich fan or, dare I say it, even a Manchester United fan, but I'm not. I am a Middlesbrough fan. And I hate him for it, but I'm still a Middlesbrough fan. Anyway, so geography, family members, keep those in mind. And I'm sure for many of you, this will be important. But what this did, because my father said, this is your sport, this is your team, because of where I lived, what I then started to do is think, oh, right, okay, I'm actually quite interested in this game. This kind of thing, this plastic ball that you kick around. This is a really interesting thing, and I can be with my friends, and I can run and be out in the sunshine, and I can be like these people I've seen on TV. I've seen these people in the stadium, and these things are important. And we'll come back to this. And again, in terms of your story, you think about it. And yes, this photograph is me. This is me, the greatest player that you've never heard of. Unfortunate injury ended my career, because up until that point, I had been known as the Messi of Middlesbrough. But if you think about, for those of you who play football, or for those of you who practice any sport, you think about the joy and the excitement and the anticipation and the emotions that were inside you, and possibly still are inside you even now. And so then something in your brain starts to happen. Something in your brain starts to happen. And of course, what you then start to do is okay, so I've been to see this team play football. I've been to see this team play rugby. I've been to see this team play cricket. I've been to see this team play basketball, whatever it might be. I think I really want to do that. And you then begin to think, okay, I want to buy a kit. I want to buy a shirt. Now you can't imagine how difficult it was to find an old Middlesbrough shirt on Google Images. So this is not my shirt. I found it on Google Images, with thanks to whoever this was, their Google image. So of course, then what happens is my father and the close proximity of the stadium then led me to think, I really want to kick a ball. And you know what? I really quite like this. And then the next thing, I've got to have a shirt. I've got to buy a shirt. And so, again, I would invite you to think about, what was the first piece of kit, or what was the first piece of merchandise, or what was the first poster, the first mug, the first match day magazine, the first sticker, the first pin badge, the first hat. What was the first that you had? So I can see it now. I can see it now in my mind. This is what it looked like. Now the interesting thing is if I remember correctly, my mother had to buy the shirt, and you had to buy the badge separately. And my mother sewed on the badge onto the front. And for those of you who are a particular age, you remember this. Back in the old days, you couldn't buy a replica shirt with a badge already on there. You actually had to buy the badge and the shirt separately, and then you would have to get someone else to sew on your badge for you. But just to pause there, that's my journey in 3 slides. That's my journey from knowing nothing about football to suddenly playing it every day after school, playing football every day after school, going to see games, and then I've got to have the shirt, and I've got to buy the match day magazine, as we called programs back then. You know, I've got to buy the DVD, I've got to buy the video, I've got to buy the book, I've got to buy boots, I've got to buy socks, I've got to have the name of someone printed on the shirt. So there's a journey there. And all of you have got a journey. And I suppose what I'm trying to say in all of this is, in terms of fan engagement, it's understanding people's journeys that is really important. This is all part of fan engagement. Now, we'll talk a little more about this more specifically later, but I think it's a really crucial point. But of course, times move on. Times move on. And I'm no longer the Messi of Middlesbrough. I no longer live opposite the football stadium. My father died a long time ago. I haven't lived in my hometown for a long time. I go back relatively infrequently. Although my relatives are there, I go back relatively infrequently. But this club is still me. This club is still me. And for those of you who don't know this is the Transporter Bridge in Middlesbrough. And it's constructed out of steel that was made in the steelworks, which are just by the river, along the river from this bridge. For those of you who don't know, the Tyne Bridge in Newcastle was made in Middlesbrough. The Sydney Harbour Bridge in Australia was made in Middlesbrough. You know, so, you know, this is my town. This is where I was born. This is where I was brought up. This is what Middlesbrough represents. It's a tough town, but it's a hard-working town. It's industrious. And this is part of my identity. This is part of who I am. This is part of how I want to be seen by other people. Now, there are some of you out there who are Liverpool fans and Real Madrid fans and Ajax fans and Parma fans and Shanghai SIPG fans and Santos fans. And you have had a journey to where you are. But where you are now, there's something about Santos, there's something about Liverpool, there's something about Ajax, there's something about Middlesbrough that potentially is part of who you are. It's how you see yourself. It's how you want to represent yourself to the world. It's about what makes you feel good. It serves a particular purpose. And this is all part of your, if I could now broaden it out to say, your engagement journey. So last summer when I went home to Middlesbrough and I drove up, and every time I go to Middlesbrough, I just go and look at the stadium. Even if there are no matches on, I just go and look at the stadium because it's there, because that's me, because I'm engaged. And of course I had to go into the club shop. And I went into the club shop and I bought a Middlesbrough track top, which where I live, I tend not to wear because I'll just get beaten up if I wear my track top. But when I went to the Far East last summer, I wore my Middlesbrough track top because I am Middlesbrough. So, you know, there is something about my journey, even now, years and years and years later, I'm still buying. I don't attend very many games. In fact, I very rarely attend games. I don't buy match day magazines. You know, I don't walk around my local neighbourhood wearing a Middlesbrough hat. But what I do is every time I go up to Middlesbrough, I buy something. And that's the crucial thing. I buy something. And I guess as a shorthand for why we're doing this today, there is this thing about ultimately buying something. Now, some of you out there are engaged in a different way to me. So you're engaged with your club in a different way to me. So my engagement is really that Middlesbrough is the football team is all I've got left of Middlesbrough. That's all I've got left. So, you know, relatively few of my relatives live there. They're quite old. They certainly don't go to football. I've kind of lost contact with all my old school friends. You know, I don't hang around in the Cleveland Centre, which is the main shopping mall in Middlesbrough anymore. So the football club is really the last connection that I have with the town. But that's just my story. The question is, what's your story? And the question is, those thousands and millions of other football fans out there in the world, what are their stories and what are their engagements? And so what I want to do now is to move on to Um, Thinking about this in slightly more academic or intellectual terms, and to split it down into to three parts, because I think when I made the point earlier about, I don't think that some people who talk about fan engagement know what they're talking about. I think these three parts are really important, because essentially fan engagement is a psychological and behavioral phenomenon. I have this view. I work in business schools. My PhD is in marketing. In France, at Lyon Business School, I'm a member of the marketing department. And I have a view that good marketers are good psychologists. And for me, the essence of fan engagement is an exercise in understanding human psychology. So the reason that I told you my story is in terms of my motives. You know, as I said, my father, a family member. So my father motivated me to go and watch Middlesbrough. You know, if I turned another corner and met someone else, you know, I could have bumped into a friend who was a Newcastle United fan, although that's unlikely in Middlesbrough. You know, a Leeds United fan. There were very often Leeds United fans hanging around in Middlesbrough at the time I was a kid. You know, I could have turned another corner and a friend could have influenced me, but I was motivated by my father and by geographic proximity to go and watch Middlesbrough. Then I developed this attitude that Middlesbrough is mine. You know, this is my town, and these are my people, and this is the community that I belong in, and this is part of my identity. And it's really important that Middlesbrough win, because then, you know, when Liverpool come to town, when Manchester United come to town, when Leicester City come to town, you know, we're beating them, we're winning, we're being successful. So there's something about attitudes and how attitudes are created. And I'm going to say something about both in just a second. But then there's something about behaviors as well. And fan engagement is about getting people to behave in certain ways. And I think marketing in general is about getting people to behave in certain ways. I think business, as many of us will know, is about getting people to behave in certain ways. And this is not kind of, you know, I'm going to go and stand outside the football ground. In marketing, in commercial terms, this is about getting you to buy things. Now that's a different webinar. Are we happy with the commercialization of sport? Are we happy with the commercialization of football? You know, do we accept that? Do we buy into that? Do we feel comfortable with that? That's another webinar. You know, essentially, what you will hear is fan engagement is important, and the bottom line is making money. There's an interesting part of this though, and you'll hear the term, and I'm sure many of you are familiar with this term, monetize, which basically means how do you make money out of people. Just because someone's engaged and they are behaving in a certain way, it doesn't mean that you necessarily make money. So I'll be honest, Middlesbrough makes virtually no money out of me whatsoever. I maybe spend £50 a year maximum, £1 a week on Middlesbrough. So, you know, I'm not a big bucks high roller. I spend my money on other things. I'm engaged with other things. But nevertheless, if thousands and thousands of people spend £50 a year on their football club, then that starts to add up to lots of money. But as we know, there are some people, home kit, away kit, track top, match day magazines, corporate hospitality package, every week, home and away. You know, people who collect things. So, you know, that in itself is a really interesting one. They're the kind of culture of collecting. So there are collectors out there, you know, they like to collect lots of AC Milan merchandise, or they like to collect Grasshopper Zurich merchandise. So I think there's something really interesting in there about behavior. Before moving on to the next slide, which is a very brief slide, by the way, is I just wanted to say something about attitude. So motives, you know, I'm sure many of us will know what a motive is, and I'm sure many of us will know what behaviors are. But without wanting to become too psychologically heavy, just familiarize yourself with what an attitude is. Alternatively, we might think in terms of cognition. So what happens in your brain that leads you to behave in certain ways? Now, so when I think about going to a Middlesbrough game, when I was young, I always remember the smell of Woodbine cigarettes. Now, for those of you who don't know Woodbine cigarettes, back in the old days, old English guys would smoke Woodbine cigarettes, and they were really strong and they smelt really, really kind of pungent. And I always remember the three guys behind me who were always the same guy. I mean, it's amazing. The same three guys every week behind, and they would smoke Woodbine cigarettes. And I can even remember it now. You know, I can remember the smell. And so in terms of engagement and in terms of attitudes and in terms of behaviors, there's something really powerful going on there. And you know, cognitively inside my brain, you know, the connections are sparking, and this is all part of engagement. And so whenever I smell someone smoking Woodbine cigarettes nowadays, I think, Middlesbrough Football Club. So, you know, it's an incredibly powerful phenomenon. So at this stage, what I would say to people and to implore people to do is don't undervalue or underestimate the need for research in understanding fan engagement. I'm an academic. Research is the name of my game. It's part of core business for me. I don't want to get into detailed discussions about research, but if you think about all those thousands and thousands and thousands and thousands of football fans with all of their personal stories and all of their motives and their attitude formation, their cognition, their behaviors, you can never know what these are without engaging in research. And so I think research and understanding the research is a really, really important thing to do if you are somebody who works for a club or works for a sport and is trying to understand about engagement. Anyway, just to quickly, so two things. First thing is I'll look at the questions and statements in a moment, but just before I do that, so when you're sat in a meeting, or you're sat in a lecture, or you're sat in a seminar, and someone's talking about fan engagement, challenge them. Say, okay, so talk me through the journey, talk me through the motives, talk me through the cognition and the attitudes, talk me through the behaviors. You know, map that process for me, map that journey for me. And I'd be interested to see how people do that, you know, because I think this is the part that people don't understand, that engagement is a psychological and behavioral phenomenon. Okay, I'm going to stop sharing for just a second and take a look at some of the statements. Mihai, great question. You think there is a difference between fan engagement for national teams versus fan engagement for club teams? 100%. 100%. The research that I've been doing over the last 3 or 4 years in the Gulf region tends to suggest that fans have 4 teams. They've got a local club team. They've got an international club team. They've got their own national team, Qatar, Saudi Arabia, Abu Dhabi, United Arab Emirates, Bahrain. But then they've got an international national team. So they've got 4 different teams. They're fans of 4 different teams. And you might hear or read some people talking in terms of portfolio fandom or portfolio consumption. But what's really interesting about those 4 teams is very often they support them for different reasons. And so I think as you begin to understand engagement, it's not straightforward. It is actually very complex, and trying to get people to understand or to distinguish between the differences, I think, is a big challenge for researchers. So that's actually a really great question. Nicola, you buy cheese bearing the crest of your own team. Nicola, thank you for attending today. I know you're a regular, but you're banned from my future webinars. Anybody who buys cheese with their own crest on it, the team crest on it, you need to seek help immediately. Yeah, loyalty programs, interesting one to say. Yeah, Bhavin, proximity is really interesting. We're going to talk about motives in just a second, but proximity is really interesting because when I was a kid, I used to walk the streets when I was a kid thinking, we need some kind of internet device, we need some kind of web type thing so we can talk to each other. Back when I was a kid, you were lucky if you had a telephone in your house, let alone a telephone in your pocket. So proximity was very much, there it is, it's in front of you. But proximity now, obviously through digital technology, is a very different notion. And going back to the research that I've been doing in the Gulf region, and also in East Asia, in places like China, the role that mobile technology, the role that digital technology plays in engagement, as many of you, I'm sure you will know, is a really important part of this. And that leads you into a whole kind of things like, with what sort of content do people engage, and through which platforms do people engage? How does co-creation take place? There are a huge number of issues that to consider in this context, but I think fundamentally, and I guess this is what the session today is all about, is fundamentally proximity is still an issue. So whether the football stadium is just in front of your house, or whether your football team is 2 or 3 kilometers away, or whether your football team is thousands and thousands of kilometers away and you access them via mobile device, fundamentally it's all about proximity and accessibility. So I'm just talking from my personal perspective. You will all obviously all have a view on this, but crucially, in terms of your own fan journey, in terms of your own fan engagement, try to think about such things like proximity. Why was it important, and what does it mean anyway for you? What did it mean anyway for you? I'll come back to talk about it in just a sec. Nicola, yeah, okay. It's something obviously not just about teams. There's also something about players, and as many of you may know already, there is a view out there in the world. In fact, there is evidence out there in the world that nowadays, younger fans, and we'll go into what a fan is, younger fans are more likely to engage with a player than a team. And so it doesn't really matter where Ronaldo plays. It doesn't really matter where Messi plays. It doesn't matter where Mbappe plays. What's really, really important is the player themselves. And so that in itself, again, is a really interesting one. Okay. Don't ask me Newcastle United questions, please. I seem to spend most of my life answering questions from irate and sometimes abusive Newcastle United fans. Once this whole takeover thing is gone, I'm gonna go for a lie down for a year and not answer any questions about Newcastle United ever again. Okay. Russell, we have a female student, Romanian, family home is in Leicester, team is well. I'm a white, middle-class, middle-aged male. And there is something about me as a human being that I share in common with a young Romanian student, female student, traveling from Leicester and being from Leicester, following a team from Barcelona. So I think there are certain fundamental human characteristics, which we're going to talk about in a moment, that motivate us all. But my lived experience as a fan, my lived experience of engagement is very different to the lived experience of Russell's student. And so I think in those terms, again, I come back to the point about research. I'm telling you that, I'm giving you a webinar using my white, middle-class, middle-aged man's spectacles, my goggles. And I'm trying to keep it broad. I'm trying to keep it wide. I'm trying to understand how it is for female fans, for fans in Japan or China, for Santos and Corinthian fans in Brazil. And there are certain fundamental truths, but then there are certain specific characteristics that I can never know. I can never understand. My lived experience doesn't tell me those things. Hence, this is why research is important. Let me quickly scroll. Oh, gee, just so... Shana, thanks for... I teach football fan engagement. There you go. Beware of people who teach football fan engagement like me. What do we know? Maybe we know something. Maybe we know nothing. Anyway, go back to sharing screen if I can. So, research is important. Really, really important. Now, the next photograph I'm going to show you, and this is what I mean about my lived experience. And for those of you, for those of you who know me, for those of you who've been in my class or have met me, and I know there are quite a few in the room today, I think I'm an okay guy. I know some people don't like me, but I know some people like me as well. But I'm not an especially flamboyant kind of guy. I've got my grey jumper on today, but when I looked at the next photograph, I thought, why did they do that? Why did they do that? And so I'm going to show you this, and some of you, when I show you this photograph, are going to say, I do that. Whereas I look at this and think, I don't do that. And I could never imagine in a million years doing this. But nevertheless, it reinforces this point that I've just made about fan engagement is complex, and what I do isn't necessarily what other people do. What you do may not be necessarily what other people do, but psychologically and behaviorally, there's something really interesting, something really important about it. Now, quite why what appear to be men, not unlike me, would do, why you would wear a Harry Kane mask to a football match as a man. I can't imagine wearing a Jonathan Woodgate mask going to a Middlesbrough game. I would be so embarrassed to do that. But that's me. That's my psychology. I think the other thing as well, and arguably just as important, if not more important, is their fandom, their notion of fandom is different to my notion of fandom. So my notion of fandom is once a year, I'll go and stand outside an empty football stadium, and then I'll go into the club shop and buy one piece of merchandise. These fans, their engagement seems to be, I'm going to wear a Harry Kane mask and go to a football match wearing a Harry Kane mask. Interesting too that the two on the left are obviously wearing retro Tottenham Hotspur shirts. Back in the good old days when shirts were really shirts, you got the Tottenham Hotspur Hummel shirt, and that I think this is really important in terms of fan engagement. In terms of fan engagement, nostalgia and history are really important. And for those of you who perhaps can't quite comprehend or get to grips or truly appreciate the role that nostalgia plays, in Britain, what we've been doing, many football fans, is for the last 7 or 8 weeks, whilst there's been no live football, is we've been watching old football matches on TV. So keep in mind that nostalgia sells. And when you think about this elongated process of engagement over which people are fans, so you become a fan when you're 5 years old and you're still a fan when you're 95. Try to imagine the life cycle of consumption over that period of 90 years or 70 years. So my fandom now is more than 50 years old. So I'm consuming a product, I'm consuming a brand. I'm really struggling now. What else do I consume that for that long? I just haven't consumed anything for that long, for 50 years. And so there's something about the longevity of engagement. There's something about the life cycle across that engagement. But there's something too about nostalgia. Nostalgia sells. Now, some of you will some of you will know this famous football phrase. It's the hope that kills you. It's the hope that kills you. And so, you know, very often it's, as football fans, we're looking forward to hope, which is part of the engagement journey. But equally, we're also looking at nostalgia. Nostalgia is part of the engagement journey. So the reason that I put up this slide is to really to say that fans are not just supporters. Fans are not just followers. And that's the crucial thing. Fans are not just supporters. They're not just followers. Fans are intensely, psychologically, behaviorally connected to the teams that they support. And you know this feeling. You know how this is. You know, you're all part of this. I know you are, because I know some of you out there. So when I bought a Peugeot car, and it broke down quite a lot, and I decided I'm not going to buy a Peugeot car anymore. So I started buying VW cars, and VW cars don't break down. So I always buy VW cars. So I brand switched. Middlesbrough Football Club always breaks down. It's like having the football equivalent of a Peugeot, but I've never brand switched. And so there is something about fandom, or it appears that there's something about fandom, psychologically and behaviorally, that we don't brand switch. We don't, and you know what it is. If you're a United fan, you ain't going to support City. If you're an Arsenal fan, no way are you going to switch to Tottenham. If you're an AC fan, you would rather die than support Inter. So there's something particularly interesting about the intensity, the psychological and behavioral intensity of engagement, of fandom. And I would say that fandom and being a fan is not the same as being a supporter. It's not the same as being a follower. Now, for those intellectuals and academics amongst you, there's a really great literature in marketing on brand fans, because you don't just get brand fans in football. You get brand fans in, fighting fantasy games, for example. You get brand fans in cinema, people who collect Star Wars things. You get brand fans in fashion, people who always collect Chanel items. So for those of you who are working in this field and perhaps want to get a broader perspective of fans and what fandom is, look at that literature on brand fans, which I think is really interesting. So as you know by now, for people who've been before to the webinars, I don't go through my slides. I'll leave you to look at these slides later and screenshot them or watch the webinar back again. The point I'm trying to make is this is a presentation on fan engagement. It's not a presentation on supporter engagement. It's not a presentation on follower engagement. It's not a presentation on people who are vaguely interested, or people who are aware there's a football club in town engagement. This is about fan engagement. So defining my terms, I just wanted to talk about fans before moving on. But I also just wanted to talk about, as well, engagement. And there's at least one student in my class who's going. So there's one student here today who's been in one of my classes, and she's going to say, he's talking about marriage and divorce again. There's something really interesting when it comes to relationships, and what we're talking about today is relationships between people and football clubs, or between people and football, or between people and basketball, or between people and Leicester Tigers Rugby Club. Whenever you're talking about a relationship, one of the most fundamentally important relationships that many of us have in our lives is with another person. And I'm guessing that for most of us, long before everybody in football started talking about fan engagement, for most of us, the word engagement, the context within which the word engagement was most frequently used was in terms of marriage. So I remember, even when I was a kid, watching Middlesbrough with my father. When my mother and father talked, or when my relatives talked, they talked about being engaged to be married. Our friend has just become engaged to be married. This is not a webinar about getting married and staying married, or getting divorced, or having arguments, or living happily ever after. Or I guess it is to a certain extent. But what I would invite you to do is to think about when people say, I'm getting engaged to become married. In your mind, what does that mean? Now, I think historically, what it means is, you've got this deep and intimate connection with someone. And this deep and intimate connection with this person means that you identify with them, that you trust them, that you are committed to being with them, and that in theory at least, in theory at least, it means that you're going to stay with them for the rest of your life. So that's the common use. When we talk about engagement, that's what commonly we think about. I really like this other person. I think we've got a lot in common. They make me feel good. I think I make them feel good. We're going to get together. We're going to live happily ever after, and it's going to last a long time. And so fan engagement is essentially, this is what it's about. It's about deep and intimate connections with a club. And these deep and intimate connections with a club will drive how you drive conversations, drive how you speak about the club, the team. They will also influence your purchase decisions. But what's really interesting, and again, if you want, for those of you who are now you're fixated on getting married and engagements, or getting divorced even, or kind of walking out on your partner or whatever else, I'll park that, but do recall it, because we get into relationships with people because they're mutually beneficial, because they're co-creative, so we co-create together. And I guess in marriage, the co-creation comes in terms of living together and building a life together and having kids together. But in football terms, co-creative is you're in this with the club together, and you're going to be there, rain or shine. You're going to sing songs. You're going to show your support. You're going to travel to away games. You're going to go to that Champions League final. But it's also experiential and emotional too. So again, these are key features. So what essentially you've got is a mix of psychological and behavioral factors that is in kind of layered with mutually beneficial relationships, co-creative relationships, experiential relationships, emotional relationships. And again, I take you back to, you think about yourself and what this means for you. What was your journey? But if you're working in football, you're working in motorsport, you're working in handball, whatever it might be, trying to understand this complex network of psychologies and behaviors and the way people see mutual benefit, co-creation, experiences and emotions is a really important part of your role. So in terms of why am I saying all of this? Why have I done this seminar today? Why did I perceive the need to tell you my story? Why did I perceive the need to comment on a middle-aged guy wearing a Harry Kane mask? Why did I perceive the need to talk about marriage and engagement and staying together and having kids and divorces? Well, it's, in football terms, it's set in this context. And for those of you who are new to this, and perhaps for those of you who are not even new to it, but maybe just need to be reminded of it, Middlesbrough is not just competing with other sports in Middlesbrough for fans. Middlesbrough is competing with Newcastle United. It's competing with Formula One. It's competing with Netflix. It's competing with Zara. It's competing with whoever. Because what we now know is that certainly up until COVID-19, we'll talk a little bit about COVID-19 in just a moment, but fan engagement in the old days, in other words, up to the 31st of January 2020, fan engagement in the old days was set against the backdrop of proliferating leisure and entertainment alternatives, sports alternatives. And so the simple bottom line in all of this for any sports club or team is the need to compete with rivals. But those rivals haven't just been other football clubs, there have been multiple rivals. So fan engagement is important because, as we know, whether it's for purposes of ticketing revenue or for the purposes of merchandise sales or for the purposes of subscriptions to club online channels, you're competing against a multitude of different alternatives. So fan engagement is important for that reason. If you don't compete, you don't get fans. If you don't get fans, the end. But it's important too because fans are part of the sport product. So then they're not just a source of revenue, they're part of the product. And I remember a Middlesbrough game when I was a student in the summer of 1985, August 1985, Middlesbrough against Grimsby Town, 1985. The final score was Middlesbrough 1, Grimsby Town 5. And there was no one there. There was no one there. So you can see in my engagement journey, this causes me pain. But there was no one there. There were like 3,000 people in a stadium that originally held 42,000 people. And it was just terrible. It just felt like the end. And if anybody knows Middlesbrough, it was the end because we went bankrupt the year after. So fans are part of the product. So we make a noise when we go there together. We make a noise, we create drama, we create tension. We become emotional, we shout, we cheer. We sometimes get really angry and aggressive. And this is all part of this, it's all part of the product. And if the fans are not there, this is really a serious issue. We're then starting to get into COVID-19. Playing games without fans is the product is not the same. The product has changed, and this is not just an issue for fans. It's also an issue for sponsors, for TV companies, for commercial partners, because very often, let's think about a sponsor. I don't know. Let's think about Chevrolet. I've got no particular view about Chevrolet. It's an American car brand, etc., etc. I don't really think anything of it. But if you're a Manchester United fan, suddenly your passion for the club begins to transfer onto the brand, and so suddenly people do feel more passionate. All those Manchester United fans around the world do feel something differently about Chevrolet, and so in that sense, fan engagement is important, not just to the people in the stadium, but also to the likes of Chevrolet. So fans are part of the product. Yes, they are a source of revenue, but fans are also advocates. So they go around. So for example, what they do is they say, "Hey, Simon, that club across the road, Middlesbrough, I think you should, come with me. Saying to your daughter, hey, just, come with your dad. Come with your dad to the game." Or saying to your friends, "You want something to do on a Sunday afternoon? Yeah, come with me." So fans become advocates as well. So if you can convert a supporter or a follower into an engaged fan, they then become advocates. And what's crucial about all of this, as many of you already know, we've already alluded to it, is it leads to a lifetime of consumption. And what I would do is to draw that specifically across to the second point on the slide there, which is a notion that marketers work with. So for those of you who are accountants and marketers, what some businesses will try to calculate is what is the lifetime value of a customer. So, you know, if you start watching your team at 5 years old and you're still watching your team at 95 years old, and you're buying tickets and you're buying shirts and you're buying merchandise, you're buying a hat, you're buying a mug, you're buying a match day magazine, you go on the stadium tour, etc., etc., etc. You know, calculate how much money you've spent on the club. Now, in my case, I don't think I've spent a lot. I don't know, £2,000 in my life, maybe. I don't know. I'm just guessing. Now, £2,000 is not a lot. You know, I'm sure there are people out there who spend, you know, 50, 100, £150,000. But even £2,000 that I've spent on my club, that's £2,000 that they might not otherwise have had. And so as marketing has become a more sophisticated discipline, and as fan engagement has become a pressing issue, what some club marketers will do is to try to calculate the lifetime value of a fan. Now, this is especially significant because for those of you who are marketers, or for those of you who know about marketing, or for those of you who, you know, perhaps don't know this area, trying to target everyone is difficult. So trying to chase everyone, trying to get everybody to become engaged, trying to generate lifetime value from everyone is difficult. So as part of the strategic decision of who you're going to target, understanding those groups of fans that potentially have greater lifetime value is one of the key challenges, not just for football clubs, not just for sport, but for many other industrial sectors too. The other thing to keep in mind is the other point that I've put there is about customer acquisition costs. You might want to scrub out, if you don't like the word customer because you're a fan, not a customer, is scrub that out and put fan acquisition costs. Is how much money does it cost to acquire a fan? So in marketing generally, and there are various different opinions about this, but on average, and a rule of thumb, as we would say in Britain, a rule of thumb is it costs you 3 times more to get a new fan than it does to keep an existing one. So this is why when that kid goes through your turnstile the first time, you've got them. If you want to keep them, you've got them. And by getting them at that point, by trying to engage them, once they're engaged, it's going to cost you far less money to keep them than it is to go and recruit a new customer or a new fan later. So keep that in mind. That again is some context for why this is important. Is existing customers are cheaper to keep than it costs to go and get new ones. Just quickly, for, you know, if you're asking why you're saying this, well, it's, you know, all the advertising, all the promotion, you know, all the communications with them, all the chasing them. You know, Middlesbrough, I'm here. You don't need to chase me too hard. You know, I'm here. You don't have to spend lots and lots and lots and lots and lots of money on me. You know, I'm here. So engaged customers, engaged fans, cost less to look after than those who are not engaged that you need to chase. Let me just come out of the screen again. Let me stop the share. And thank you, Bertrand. Middlesbrough fans are passionate fans. Maybe. Okay. We had a student Wolves fan calculated parents had spent £22,000. So therefore, I mean, as with every week during these webinars, for those of you who are not following the comments in the sidebar in the chat, just there's people say things just as valuable as I say. In many cases, even more valuable than the things that I say. So yeah, I mean, you know, £22,000 of lifetime value in one fan. So this is why this is particularly significant. Christopher, wouldn't I love to talk about Red Bull Leipzig? Wouldn't I love to? And Hoffenheim, for that matter. Can I get... That's another webinar. Don't ask me such questions. What's going through my mind right now is 10 years ago, actually 11 years ago, I visited Beijing with Tottenham Hotspur, and one night during my visit with Tottenham Hotspur, the director of international development said to me, would you like to come along to the Tottenham Hotspur Supporters Club Beijing? And although I'm a Middlesbrough fan till I die, I said, yeah, okay, I'll come with you. Anyway, there were two people there. Tottenham Hotspur, I didn't expect any more. There were two people there, and they were married to each other, and they were completely dressed head to toe in Tottenham Hotspur things. And it was a bit like kind of mega fandom, crazy fandom gone mad. And I remember speaking to the woman, and I said to the woman, why are you a Tottenham Hotspur fan? And she said, because my husband is. And then she added, so that's okay. That's not the problem I had with her, because, you know, just as my father influenced me, her husband influenced her. But then she added, and this is directed at you, Christopher, she added, but I'm thinking about switching to Chelsea next week. Now, at the time I thought, you don't get this. This is not how fandom works. You don't switch. But of course, as a white, middle-class, middle-aged man, my engagement is not her engagement. Her engagement is different to my engagement. And for all I know, we didn't keep in touch. Why would I want to keep in touch with two Tottenham Hotspur fans? I really don't know. Anyway, we didn't keep in touch. So for all I know, the week after she switched to Chelsea, for all I know, she's now a Red Bull Leipzig fan. So there is something about brand switchers and defectors, so brand defectors, because she seemed to me to be a brand defector. You know, and there's a whole bunch of questions and issues in there about, you know, why would you defect? Why would you switch? On what basis do you switch? What are your feelings once you've switched? How does your engagement build with your new club? How do you even select that new club? And so I think the whole, you know, Red Bull Leipzig and Hoffenheim, and for that matter, you know, even cases like Manchester City, for example, big, passionate, hardcore fandom in East Manchester that suddenly has gone global. You know, on what basis are people engaging with Manchester City right now? So, you know, again, you know, we could talk about this endlessly, but one of the things that particularly interests me is remote fans. So fans who don't live in the same place as the team that they support, and trying to understand why that is, and psychologically and behaviorally what it leads them to do, I think is just fascinating. But I think you can extend that logic to Red Bull Leipzig, or, you know, for that matter, any of the clubs in the Manchester City franchise network, or, you know, Salford City or FC United. You know, there are all kinds of examples that we could use. You know, but otherwise, you know, really good question. Yeah, thank you. As Eric Cantona said, you may change your wife, but you'll never change your football club. Jane, it is okay to be a fan. It is okay to be a fan. Nicola, I guess beer increases fan engagement. That's a really interesting observation to make, because I'll let you into a secret. It's true. So I am familiar with a PhD that I have seen at some stage in the past, where drinking beer with friends is part of fan engagement. Amazing, isn't it? Just amazing. Whoever would have thought it? I give up now. It was a waste of my time doing that PhD. I shouldn't have bothered. Drinking beer leads to fan engagement. That's all you need to know. I'll come to that in just a second. But socializing is a really important part of this. So I'm going to go back to my presentation, because I realize we've been going for quite some time, as usual. And I just want to quickly move on. So what I want to do now is just really kind of 3 things to conclude. And I try to do it quite quickly, because I know some of you got to go and do other things. First one is to talk about motives. Second one is to talk about attitudes. And the third one is to talk about behaviors. And I talked earlier about fundamental truths about people. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs, as we have here, is, I think, a fundamental truth about people. And this helps us to understand our motives. I remember when I was a student, and whenever I was in a business class, someone would always put up a slide of Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And I used to think, why are you showing this? Why, this is like the 200th time this academic year I've seen this. Why are you showing this? And I always undervalued Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And yet, as I've got older, I've kind of thought, right, okay, that's actually a good way of explaining things. And Maslow's hierarchy of needs is a good way of explaining things. And as I hunted for a screenshot of a Maslow hierarchy of needs, I was thinking about COVID-19, about the virus. And I was thinking about fan engagement during the COVID-19 era. On my Twitter timeline 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I tweeted details of a study that had been undertaken in the United States among sport fans, where 70% of the respondents had indicated that they will not attend another sporting event. So in other words, they won't go to another game until a vaccine for coronavirus has been developed. You look at Maslow's hierarchy of needs, one of the things that motivates us is the need for safety and security. So I'll be honest, I've got no plans anytime soon to go and watch live sport. No way. Because I would want to social distance. I wouldn't want to catch the virus. I don't want to die. And so safety and security, as part of my engagement with any sport right now, is going to be a key motivator. So again, in terms of fandom and fan engagement, what I would invite you to do is to think about your team, your club, your sport, and to reflect upon how Maslow's hierarchy of needs relates to what motivates you to engage with that sport. You'll notice in Maslow's hierarchy of needs, I've talked about my dad. He's in there, right in the middle. Social needs, friendship, family. We are motivated by family members. Family members motivate us to do certain things. For those out there who celebrate Christmas, if you've got kids and you celebrate Christmas, you know what it's like. You've got your 5-year-old or your 10-year-old saying, I've got to have, I've got to have, I've got to have, I've got to have. It's what we call pester power. And pester power is an incredibly important influence on the money. It's a motivator for the money that parents spend each Christmas. If I talk about me in Middlesbrough, can't remember the last time I went to a game. Never really watch on TV, but every year I go up and I buy a piece of merchandise. But I am Middlesbrough. It is me. So I'm self-actualizing. So what I'm doing, in terms of authenticity, I was born in Middlesbrough. I was brought up in Middlesbrough. I went to school in Middlesbrough. I suppose in many ways, my career was forged in Middlesbrough, because where I am now is a reflection of coming from Middlesbrough. So there's something about authenticity. So for all of us, I think Maslow's hierarchy of needs as fans is really important. But some of you will also know that in the sport fan literature, there are other motivators in there as well. And some of them map onto our Maslow's hierarchy of needs. And they obviously map onto Maslow's hierarchy of needs. But in other cases, they don't. So I'm going to, if I pick out the one, I probably, well, actually two. If I pick out two that specifically, actually three, I'm going to pick the whole list in the end. I'm going to pick three. So number one for me is aesthetics, because it's just brilliant to watch great football. It doesn't matter who's playing it, particularly for a Middlesbrough fan, because there's not much great football in Middlesbrough. But if it's Red Bull Leipzig or Wisła Kraków or Kyoto Purple Sanga or Beijing Guan, or it doesn't matter. If it looks good, it looks good. So for me, aesthetics. Second one is drama, because to watch a game, you know the kind of games when it's just end to end and hitting the crossbar, and it's 5-4 in the 89th minute, and so for me it's drama. And the other one is place, because I like to watch obscure football matches in obscure places. So the more obscure the football match, the more obscure the place, the weirder the football kit looks. That's great for me. So that's that's now part of my engagement. That's what engages me. But again, I'm talking about me. You might have a different view. These are only some of the motivators. But I think the challenge for you, and for those of you who particularly those of you who are working in the industry or potentially will work in the industry, is understanding motives is really important. Now, what I've just said there, I like to watch obscure football matches in obscure places, played by obscure footballers between obscure teams. Some of you could rightly ask the question, what is wrong with you, Simon? And what I would say in return is, there's just something about obscurity that I really find interesting. So then if you were to start to ask me, okay, Simon, so to talk to me about obscurity. So we're then into, my brain. And I think I'm going to need probably 2 years worth of therapy with a qualified psychologist or psychiatrist to begin to explain what goes on in my brain. And so all I'm putting up now is this is your brain. This is my brain. These are our brains. So we can think about what motivates, as we've just done. We can think about what motivates. But at the same time, we also then need to begin to think in terms of cognition, in terms of attitude formation, in terms of psychology, in terms of understanding how your brain works. What is it about obscurity that appeals to me? I think I like obscurity because I like things that are different. Why do I like things that are different? Because I like people and things that stand out for all the wrong reasons. I don't like the mainstream. I like counterculture. I like non-conformity. So there you go. I didn't even have to pay a counsellor. I just divulged my innermost thoughts and feelings. But that's just me. And I'm not saying that I'm typical, and I'm not saying I'm characteristic. But what I have got is a particular psychology that has been motivated by certain things, just as you do, and just as thousands and millions of other football fans do. So again, coming back to research, coming back to stories, coming back to fan engagement journeys, coming back to understanding how people live their lives, understanding what goes on in people's heads is part of what I think is important for fan engagement. And this goes back right to the very start. When I was saying I don't think people really understand sometimes what fan engagement is, it's about understanding what goes on in people's heads. So there's something about number one, motives. There's something, number two, about attitudes and cognition. But then there's something about behaviors. So that's the third element, and we are almost finished. I promise you, we are almost finished. So then we've got something about behaviors, and I juxtaposed two slides together. The first slide is of a Dutch football fan. I'm assuming he's a Dutch football fan. I think he is a Dutch football fan. And again, if I met this guy, I'd say, hey man, why did you go to the game dressed like this? I just would never do this. But for him, this clearly is important. He's decided to do this. So understanding behavior is significant. It's important. We've talked about it before, but it's only one of a number of behaviors. So part of understanding fan engagement, part of understanding the fan engagement journey, part of understanding the psychology, part of understanding how to monetize fan engagement is to understand the range of behaviors in which people engage. So my point is, for all we know, this Dutch guy is a big Bolton Wanderers fan. So this is Bolton Wanderers Stadium. This Dutch guy is a big Bolton Wanderers fan, for all we know. He's a big Fabian de Freitas fan. Dutch guy who played for Bolton Wanderers 20 years ago. But the point I'm trying to make here is, for all we know, here is a guy who wants to go absolutely, he wants to look crazy, he wants to show his fandom, he's prepared to wear an orange feather wig. I am Dutch, I'm here in town, I'm going to enjoy the game, etc. But what he does before that, he wants to be sensible, and he wants to drive his Audi or his Ford to the football stadium and park sensibly in a line and make sure that the security there, so that nobody breaks into his car and steals it, or rival fans don't smash the windscreen. But then he wants to go out there and be crazy and mad. And so my point is that we very often, as fans, in this fan engagement journey, engage in a variety of different behaviors. And so in terms of research, in terms of understanding, it's not just about motives, not just about psychology, it's also about understanding diverse range of behaviors. And I throw into that mix the notion of a life cycle. So going back to those first slides, as a 5-year-old, I was perfectly happy to walk around Middlesbrough town centre wearing a red shirt and red shorts. I am Middlesbrough. You would never get me in shorts nowadays, not even in 50-degree heat on holiday. You're not going to get me in shorts. And I certainly wouldn't walk around places in a football shirt. So as fans, we've got a diverse range of behaviours, but those behaviours are very often bound up in, for example, age. And so understanding the life cycle of fans and how their behavior changes, I think, is really important. So moving on, just to kind of quickly wrap up. There's a few slides, but I'm going to do them very quickly. I think what's really important in terms of fan engagement, I alluded to it earlier, is you can't, as a club, you probably don't have the time or the resources to chase everyone. So you've got to have a sense of lifetime value. You've got to have a sense of those segments that will deliver most value to you as a club. You may choose to target segments that are most likely, that you perceive are most likely to engage with you as a club. So these could be, for example, women. As I mentioned earlier, and I don't want to labour the point too much, but I'm not a woman. So what motivates women to attend games and become fans, I don't necessarily understand. Research has to drive my understanding. At the same time, I'm not a kid. I don't understand how a 10-year-old engages with football clubs nowadays. So therefore, I'm reliant upon research. What I would say, however, is certainly from the point of view of this guy here, is he's more likely to stay engaged with his team because he's young and his mother or his father has taken him to the game for the first time and he just loves it, and that's now going to be his team. You could take me to go and watch this team. I'm not interested in engaging. I'm just not. I'm a different phase of my life cycle. So not only do I necessarily not understand him because I'm white, middle class, and middle aged, but at the same time he's younger, and his engagement journey may be considerably different to mine. Now, I just wanted to kind of wrap up by showing you, this caught my attention on LinkedIn, and you can see there at the bottom, Mr. Blair Hughes, whoever Mr. Blair Hughes is. And Mr. Blair Hughes, if you're here today, hi, Mr. Blair Hughes. I've got to be careful not to start abusing Mr. Blair Hughes, just in case. In fact, let me check the list of participants. Is Blair Hughes here? No, Blair Hughes isn't. Right, okay, so we can criticise Blair Hughes as much as we want to. Now, Blair, if you listen to the recording, we love you. But he put a big list together of fan engagement ideas. And when I looked at this, I thought, super cool, that's great. But what I would invite Mr. Blair Hughes to do, and what I would invite all of you to do, is to look at Mr. Blair Hughes's list and to think in terms of the 200 plus fan engagement ideas that he's put together, and try to think about them in terms of motives, attitudes, behaviors. And if I was to ever meet Mr. Blair Hughes, who I'm sure is a very nice guy, I would say, Mr. Blair Hughes, can you explain to me, for each of those 200 measures that you've advocated, what about motives? What about attitudes and cognition? What about behaviors? Now, for those of you who can't see this or don't particularly want to go and look and find it, if I show you, that's just a screenshot of a selection that he gives. So, go and look at that list. And as you're looking at that list, think about how does it tally? How does it align with your experience? How does it align with your engagement? How does it align with what we've said today? And if you agree with them, great. You agree with them, fantastic. Here's a resource for you. If you don't agree with them, as I say, try to conceive of them, try to understand them, try to deconstruct them, try to put some discipline behind them and understand how motives, attitudes, behaviors. I'm just looking at one there, Q&As, and I'm sure there's more to it than just Q&As. What kind of Q&As? Why would anybody, on what basis would anybody be motivated to engage in Q&As? You would really have to build that out and understand it far better. You've also got one down at the bottom of the list, rewatch classic games. So nostalgia, I've talked about nostalgia before, so I'll leave that with you. Just picking out the other one is for those of you who have any interest in Spanish football. I got an email from La Liga. For some reason, I'm on a La Liga mailing list, La Liga Britain mailing list. And I got sent a whole bundle of stuff via email, digital content via email from La Liga last week. And it grabbed my attention. And one of the reasons it grabbed my attention is because I like colourful images. In terms of my motives and psychology, I like colourful images. And so this caught my attention. But without going into too much detail and showing you particular examples, all I'll do is show you this colourful image because it's colourful, but also direct you to, if you have any interest in what some sports organisations are doing during COVID-19, is take a look at some of that La Liga content, which presumably on the various regional variations, the variants of the La Liga website, you should be able to find these, but certainly you find this on the English language version. Okay, so conclusions. Getting them and keeping them as a challenge. It's tough. Many of you work in business already. Football is a business in many cases now. Getting people and keeping them is difficult. It's a key challenge. It's a big challenge for Amazon. It's a big challenge for Mercedes-Benz. It's a big challenge for Emirates Airlines. it's a big challenge. So getting them and keeping them is a challenge. And for those of you who work in the industry, for those of you who aspire to work in the industry, it's a big challenge. Understanding the fan journey is crucial. Hopefully, I'm a big fan of tell yourself your own story and then try to understand what you've told yourself. So all of you are fans. I know you're fans. So tell yourself your fan story, particularly in terms of motives, cognition, behavior. Tell yourself that story and then pay attention to what you've just told yourself, because there's something quite valuable in that. I guarantee for every single one of you, there's something really valuable in that, not just for you, but in terms of understanding fan engagement more generally. I've said that research is important, but I think there's something about intuition too. So I've labored this point about researching. You've got to undertake research. You've got to understand. I don't really know how kids and kind of young women consume football. I need research, but also rely on intuition, because we are all fans. So trust yourself to know what's important for you may be important for other people as well. Fans are not a homogenous mass. We're not the same. I'm peculiar. I like obscure football matches in obscure places. Many other people don't. But what's really interesting is that trying to identify clusters of similar people is part of what fan engagement and part of what segmentation is all about. So I know for a fact there are other peculiar people like me out there in the world. I know for a fact that there are people who look for things in football that I also look for. And so again, going back to what we just talked about in terms of research and intelligence gathering, is identifying and understanding these clusters is really important. Consider differences. So for example, between with environment spelled incorrectly, I'll correct that later. But there's a difference between fandom online and fandom offline, and there are cultural differences. So I mentioned earlier about undertaking research in the Gulf, undertaking research in East Asia. Fandom is different sometimes. So there are cultural differences, there are age differences, there are gender differences. And again, particularly when, for example, a club may be seeking to enter a new market, not making assumptions about people overseas is a really important thing. You've got to go and look, you've got to go and see, you've got to go and experience, you've got to rely on research. And going back to Mr. Blair Hughes's list, I think some of those things on Mr. Blair Hughes's list are very creative and very thoughtful, but some of them are not. And so again, I think trying to understand people's psychology, motives, psychology, behavior. Good marketers are good psychologists. And then being able to translate what you think you see into creative strategies for engaging fans, I think is crucial. Thank you for listening. For those of you who have not been before, email address, Twitter account. For those of you who have been before, you know this. If you want to go now, you can. But before you go, let me just go into quickly. Yeah. Jim Wiltshire. That is a webinar. How do we even talk about that? I mean, I've got a particular view about this. My view of football is it belongs to everyone, and my view of clubs is probably they belong to it. Probably they belong to everyone as well. But I think some of the issues around overseas fans who go to watch games, for me, I just that's hey, let those people in. What's the problem? What's the issue? They're as entitled to go and watch Liverpool as anybody else. What's the problem? but I think there is something particularly interesting, and you find this especially in the Premier League, I believe, that we're getting a sense of who clubs feel are the most lucrative sources of income, because you can see that certain fan groups, certain fan segments are being targeted, and sometimes they are overseas, and that does create conflict with the domestic audience, and that domestic audience very often does feel uncomfortable. I'm very fortunate that I support a club where I don't think we've got very many fans overseas, but I can imagine how I would feel if I went to see Middlesbrough and I was the only person from Middlesbrough there, because I am Middlesbrough. It's part of my identity. And I'm not sure now, at the end of a 110-minute webinar, whether we can get into this. But there's more that I want to say, but I don't think I can now. But Jim, I think that's just a really good observation to make that I do have views about. And Christopher above has talked about Chinese fans, which is something is of particular interest to me. Manchester City building a fan base in India. Okay, so there's a whole bunch of things there. Let me have a quick look at the Q&As. Vasilis, that's just a great question. Avinash would love to answer. Dan Jones, I'm going to finish on this one. I wish I could talk for longer, but I've got to go and do other things. If anybody's got specific questions that you want to ask me, you can email me or use the Sport Assist hashtag. But I'm going to leave Dan Jones. What's the most obscure game that you've watched? I watched a game involving a team called LKS Biadasz, which is like Polish 9th division or Polish 10th division. And this game was significant because, incredibly, overseas fans went to see this game. Can you believe it? This English guy turned up at this game. I was crowding out the local fans. In fact, I was crowding out the local fans because even though I was only one, there were only about 10 local fans. LKS Biadasz lost 7-0 at home. And the following year, they went bankrupt because people decided they were so bad they weren't going to go and see them anymore. So that's probably the most obscure game that I've seen. Cool. Thank you for being here today. I wish I could have answered more. I wish I could have said more. It's just a brilliant area. I know I know Fiona, for example, has been online. She's much more of an expert in this field than I am. I'm sure there are ways of finding people like Fiona, and there are some other good professionals out there too. So hopefully I've made my contribution. You want to know more, get in touch. There are others out there. Thanks for listening. And I shall say goodbye and stay safe, stay healthy.